Losing, leaving, parting, losses, shadows, sorrows, taking, bereaving, sighing, moaning, weeping, pain, sickness, and dying, all things that we just sang about. And it, from my perspective, is another example of how things have come together to fit into our sermon this morning. The class that we had in the auditorium fit in very well with the things that I'd like to share today. Josh's songs, even speaking of the light that God is bringing and tying that in with Eric's discussion of the Lord's Supper, all fit together in the theme of who God is and who we are, who we should be as we try to serve God. I'd like to thank everyone for your presence today. We have, as I look around, I see a number of faces that are not that familiar to me. I think we have a number of visitors. We're especially glad to have you with us, and hope that we have been an encouragement to you so far, and that will continue throughout the rest of this service. And is this on? That helps. Okay, so the title of our lesson today is What Are You Doing Here, Elijah? And Rick's reading from 1 Kings 19, the first several verses there, describes kind of a transition phase. In 1 Kings 18, Elijah has had some major victories in his service to God. That takes a turn for the downhill, the worse, in the first few verses here, and we find him running. And so this lesson is describing how that God answers discouragement and despair in a great man of God. One of the things I'd like to bring out before I start this lesson, sometimes it's easy to pick up characters of history and we look at their lives and we don't really put ourselves in their circumstances, and it's easy to kind of beat up on them for the mistakes that they made. And I'd like to point out that Elijah, I don't think any of us could stand on his coattails. He's considered one of the great men of the great people of the Bible. He is one that when John the Baptist came, Jesus described John the Baptist as the greatest prophet of all, but he came in the image and power of Elijah. So anyway, Elijah is a great man of God. And he has some tough times, as we're going to describe in this lesson, and showed up in the reading. But, if that this is not to beat up on him, but so that we can learn, we can observe and learn and hopefully avoid some of the struggles that he had in our own lives as we see how God worked with him through this process. If it can happen to him as a great man of God, it can certainly happen to me. And so we want to use him as an example. This is a question that God asked Elijah. What are you doing here? As he found himself in the cave in Mount Horeb, or Mount Sinai, as it's also known as. And he asked him this twice. And I don't think that he asked this question to Elijah twice because God didn't know the answer himself. But he asked him this at two different times because he was getting Elijah an opportunity to answer that question for himself. What are you doing here? And it gives Elijah some responsibility for explaining his actions and where he is. So as we go into this lesson, again, recall that in 1 Kings 18, Elijah had boldly confronted the prophets of Baal, the false teachers and idolatrous worshipers in Israel. This is where God consumed a water-soaked altar with fire from heaven so that it just basically disappeared. This is at the request of Elijah, so God has responded to him in a miraculous way. 450 priests of Baal have been executed by Elijah, and then he prays, and through his prayer moves God to end a 3-year drought that had afflicted Israel as a hand of water came up from the Mediterranean Sea and turned into a large cloud and watered the earth. So 1 Kings 18 is a tremendous victory chapter for Elijah and his relationship with God and his impact on the nation of Israel. However, that quickly turns as Jezebel promises to take Elijah's life within 24 hours. She promises to take Elijah's life. Elijah, fresh from a miraculous faith victory, flees for his life, and in despair, ironically, he asks God to take his life. He's running to save his life from Jezebel, but then he asks God to take his life. He flees in fear to a cave in Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. And what does this run look like? And I have two maps here to kind of illustrate what he's doing when he's running from Jezebel. So the red box up at the top left is Mount Carmel. That's where the altar and the confrontation with the prophets of Baal took place. It's where he had his great victory. And so he runs and travels south, and he goes to the Dead Sea. And going south, he would have passed by the Dead Sea. And if you look at the scale that's on the bottom left of that map, it gives a 30-mile marker for his distance. And it's at least 3 of those 30-mile marks between Mount Carmel and the Dead Sea. Okay, so at least 90, maybe close to 100 miles that he traveled to get that far south. And then if you go to the map on the right, the Dead Sea is now in the red box in the upper right. And from there to go down to where it's assumed that Mount Sinai is, the scale of miles there is on the bottom right is 100-mile increments. And so there's at least 2 and plus some there. So he traveled probably around 100 miles to get down to the Dead Sea. And then he traveled probably another couple 100 miles to get from the Dead Sea down to Mount Horeb. In a late moment of trying to be modernized, I Google AI'd that distance, and I was told that it's about 334 miles, approximately, 334 miles from Mount Carmel down to Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. So that's a pretty good journey on foot, and that's how far he went away to get away from Jezebel's vow to have his life taken. So that's where he is at this point. So I'd like to continue the reading in 1 Kings 19. Rick read the first 8 verses for that, and I'd like to continue with verse 9, and I'm going to read a section through verse 14, and then we'll come back and kind of break that down into sections. So in 1 Corinthians 19, and beginning of verse 9, it says, "There he came to a cave and lodged in it, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' Elijah then, he said, 'I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away.' And he said, 'Go out,' he being God, and he said, 'Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord.' And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak, and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said again, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?' And he gives the same answer. He said, 'I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away.'" So I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the question that God asked Elijah. What are you doing here? And as I was looking at this section of Scripture several years ago, I was trying to understand what was going on between God and Elijah, I kind of started wondering, I wonder how God said that. I wonder, did he emphasize certain words that gave different inflection to the question? And what would it mean if he had used different inflections for different words? So I thought about what impression I might have had if I'd heard God asking this question with emphasis on different words in the sentence. And so God might have said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" His emphasis may have been on the you part of it. And you implies some aspect of identity. What are you doing here? And who was Elijah? Well, Elijah is my prophet. You are my prophet. You're a chosen agent for me, and you've been called by me. This is a special place that you hold in your identity for me. You're among the greatest prophets. As I mentioned earlier, John the Baptist was prophesied to come in the power and spirit of Elijah. Of all the prophets of the Old Testament, he came in the spirit of Elijah. And then in Matthew 17, when we have the transfiguration of Jesus, there are two people that came and communed with Jesus, talked with Jesus, and it was Moses and Elijah. Moses is a great prophet and also a lawgiver, and Elijah, representing the greatest of prophets of God's people in the Old Testament. So he, again, was an extremely great and powerful man in God's service, and we need to respect and appreciate. I think of comparing myself to that. There is no comparison. And any of us, I think, would love to be able to have the relationship with God that Elijah had throughout most of his life. He offered one of the most exemplary faith prayers in the history of the Bible. In 1 Kings 18, is when he prayed for the drought to end, and then God blessed the land with rain based on his prayer. And James, in chapter 5, verses 16 through 18, basically gives Elijah as the model prayer that we could give and have the expectation through faith that God would answer our prayers by modeling after Elijah. It's not a part of this lesson, but I would suggest that when God answered Elijah's prayer for rain to come back on the earth, which James says is a model prayer for us to, show and have faith in our prayer life, that God did not answer with a miracle. When it describes how the rain came, there was moisture that came up from the sea, like a cloud, a hand of a cloud. And the clouds gathered more and more and then moved over the land, and they dumped their water on the land. That's the way it rains every time it rains, is that there's moisture that comes up from the earth, and it goes to another place and precipitates on that other place. That's a natural process. And Elijah's faith and the example of his prayer is given as an example that we should follow and the faith that we should have in making our requests made known to God. So this, again, his identity is of a great person in God's eyes and is illustrated by many things. But yet, if that is who Elijah is, what is he now? What is his identity now? He's depressed, he's discouraged, he's hiding in a distant cave. And I think that God, if he emphasized the you in that question, he's maybe pointing out that you know me, you know who I am, and your identity is all these things to me, a prophet, a chosen agent, you've been called by me. So what are you doing here? And as we think about how Elijah might have answered that question, I would encourage us to think about a little bit of introspection and reflection. What about me? In my life, what am I doing where I am? What is my identity? What is my relationship with God? What am I doing wherever I am? And certainly none of us would, I think, jump up and claim, well, I'm just like Elijah. I'm a great prophet and I'm a chosen agent and I've been called by God to influence the world. Well, that latter part may, play some role in our identity, but we need to have an identity that is tied to God. And that identity being tied to God should be motivation for me to act in certain special ways wherever I am in my life. What about my job? Being who I am, being who you are in your relationship with God, does that influence how you behave on the job? What about in our families? What about in my schooling? Who am I? Who am I in those various relationships? Does that affect my self-identity? And would others recognize who I am based on the way that I act? Would they recognize that I'm a child of God, that I live with honesty and integrity, and that I have a good work ethic, and that I treat other people with kindness and love and respect? You know, that's who I should be if I'm like Jesus. What am I doing wherever I am in my stage of life? I encourage us to reflect on that some, and maybe we need to bolster our identity some and be stronger in that identity. But God may have put the emphasis on a different word in the sentence. What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing? Doing would imply purposeful activity. What purposeful activity are you doing in this cave over 300 miles away from where my action is going on? What are you doing here, Elijah? Well, I think we could say that Elijah's hiding. He's, I think, sulking, right? He's self-absorbed. Did you hear how he answered God's question, what are you doing here, Elijah? I am a prophet of God. That's who I am. And I've been doing righteousness on your behalf. But they, Israel, all of it, everyone in Israel, not just Jezebel, everyone in Israel is out to get me. And they've been destroying your prophets and your plans. They've been working against you. Everyone is against you except for me, and I'm here, and they're trying to kill me. So he's feeling hopeless. And I would say that he's, a phrase that I like to use, nursing his negatives. He found things that are going against him, that are not in his favor, and he's milking them to get the most out of them that he can. And sometimes, do we ever have things that happen to us that we do not want to happen to us? And I think we talked about this in class some, that we expect the worst out of those things. We anticipate the worst. We nurse the negatives, and it gives us a complex of how we look at ourselves and our role in serving God. It inhibits purposeful activity when I nurse the negatives that might be occurring in my life. What we do, I'll just take a little aside here about this doing and purposeful activity. What we do in our lives on a daily basis is determined by our attitude toward what we are doing. And our attitude often shows up in our posture, the way that we hold ourselves, the way we carry ourselves. You know, if we're engaged in purposeful activity, there generally is going to be a way that we carry ourselves that conveys to other people that we're doing purposeful activity. If I'm feeling sorry for myself, if I'm discouraged, in despair, depressed, then often that carries over in our posture. What do other people see in our posture? What does God see in our posture? I want to bring this back to Elijah, but first, before we talk about Elijah again, posture of purpose. I wonder if anybody recognizes this photograph. Some of you might be able to tell me who the basketball player actually is. I see some shaking heads. Okay, so what is he doing here? Yeah, I mean, like, he's sitting there, he's sitting on the bench, and he's got a towel over his head. Does this posture represent to you that this is a positive posture? Is this a negative posture? Or is this just neutral? You know, it doesn't mean anything. When you first see that and that pops up, what kind of jumps into your mind? I wanted a football picture because I pay more attention to football than particularly professional basketball, but this came up first. So I wonder if I'm thinking about what's going on in the game, if I see, like in the fourth quarter of a football game, and the starting quarterback is sitting on the bench, and he takes his helmet off, and he's got a towel hung over his head so that I can't see his face, would I guess that that's the starting quarterback that just threw a 60-yard bomb pass that was the winning touchdown of the game, would they be sitting on the bench like this? Or maybe it's a running back that has just, broken a long run, scored a touchdown, it's going to be the winning touchdown. Does he come over to the bench and sit like this on the bench? No, this is somebody typically that represents someone who's given up, someone who is in despair. In verse 13 of our passage, God demonstrates his power to Elijah, and at one point, Elijah goes out to see what God has to show, and we'll get into that in just a moment. But before he went out, it says he wrapped his face in his cloak. And when I read that, this picture is what came to mind. He's putting a cloak over his head, over his face. He's given up. He's hiding his face. He doesn't want to be seen. That's the picture that portrays to us. This was a news article, and the title of the news article, LeBron James preaches patience amid disappointing start. This is the posture of disappointment and despair. This is someone not being where they would like to be in their life and in their purpose. And so we need to be careful about how we carry ourselves, because oftentimes the way we carry ourselves illustrates where our thinking is and what our sense of purpose is and what we're doing. And I think that often the natural course of how this happens is that we know or we think certain things, and then that knowledge affects the way we feel about those things. So knowledge affects the way we feel, our attitude, and then our attitude is then demonstrated in our actions and as well as in our posture. And so there's a continuum here from what I know to how I feel to what I do. And if I'm starting out with a negative, I'm going to end up with a negative. But we also, I think that works to some degree in reverse as well. If I control what I'm doing and I control my posture and how I look, I can maintain a more positive attitude about what I'm trying to accomplish. And so our posture is important. It has an impact on how we feel about things and also what we do. There is a, excuse me just a second. There are times when we're going to be defeated. What do we do when we get defeated? How do we respond to that being defeated in something that we're trying to accomplish? We're trying to accomplish a purposeful activity. We're trying to do what's right and good, and we get defeated in that. We can give up with that. We can succumb to that, but we also can maintain an attitude of resiliency, that I may have failed, or circumstances may have impacted me that are not favorable, that are negative, they're harmful to me, but I can still maintain the attitude that what I'm doing with my life and my attitude is going to be purposeful and it's going to show activity. And it's kind of like in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning in verse 7, here we have Elijah who has suffered defeat. He's suffered threats against his life. He has been overcome with the threat of these things against his life. We could suffer that and maintain a positive attitude that, I'm down for right now, but God is on my side, and I'm going to be resilient, and I'm going to keep fighting for what is good and that would honor God. Or we can give up, and we can stop trying. I think the idea of continuing to try and continuing to do meaningful activity is described by Paul in 2 Corinthians 4. Beginning in verse 7, he says, "We have this treasure, the gospel of Christ, in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body of the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifest in our bodies. So Elijah has succumbed to the persecution that has come on him. But Paul gives us a picture of a different way to approach that with the right mental attitude toward that. We can be afflicted but not crushed, perplexed but not driven to despair, persecuted but not forsaken. And so it is the hope that Jesus gives us in a resurrection to life that should allow us, regardless of what persecution or difficulty or circumstance of life faces us, that gives us the hope and also then the posture of, I'm not giving up. I'm going to continue to fight this battle, even though I have maybe lost the last round. I'm going to keep fighting until death overcomes. And at that point, we can look forward to the resurrection of hope. So, again, tying this to ourselves, having reflection about how would I answer to this? What am I doing, John, here? So, what am I doing? What is my posture? Am I going through a tough time? And does my posture reflect that I have given up, or does my posture reflect that I am still fighting because God is on my side and He is going to deliver me? And our posture is dependent on where our focus is. Where's our focus? Elijah, at this point in time, I would suggest, is self-centered. He has a self-centered focus. So he's feeling pity. He's apathetic. He's idle. He's not doing anything constructive. And sometimes we even turn to the point of doing something destructive when our focus is on ourselves rather than focusing on God. God-centered focus always helps us to be purposeful in what we're doing. We're thoughtful as to how can I respond in a way that will be most positive and that will honor and glorify God. It's going to move me to being active and not just hiding in a cave. It's going to cause me to think of what can be done that would be constructive in this circumstance, to help build the circumstance up and other people. So when we're thinking about, are we doing purposeful activity, we need to concentrate on having a God-centered focus so that we are purposeful, and we need to maintain our posture of, I am working for God, and I'm not going to stop even though I've had this setback with the circumstances that I'm facing. But then again, God may have put emphasis on another word. What are you doing here, Elijah? Well, what are you doing here? He's in an isolated cave. He took 40 days to run away from Jezebel, went over 300 miles by foot, 40 days of running away, more or less lost to everything that's going on in the world. What are you doing here? Is this a place of strategic purpose in fulfilling God's mission? Can I get a lot done in an isolated cave all by myself? Elijah did not have a cell phone or a computer or something where you might be doing stuff productively in an isolated place. What of God's mission is going to occur in this cave? Again, Elijah is lost in his mission and in his location. And again, I encourage us to do a little bit of reflection. Where am I in my life? And we might think of that in a figurative sense, or as it applies to different places that I might fulfill in my life. What am I doing here? Have I isolated myself so that I don't have to interact with anyone? So I can't be a positive or a negative influence. I'm just isolated. And is that where I'm comfortable? And is that where God's work gets done? With me in isolation from everyone else. And that isolation can be physical. It can be mental. We can separate ourselves from others mentally, emotionally, or spiritually. So let's think about, have I isolated myself in any of these ways that prevents me from doing the purposeful activity that is worthy of who I am as God's child and the servant of Jesus? Or am I being strategic in where I am? Have I gone to places that are going to give me opportunity? And that might be having personal studies with people related to the Bible and God. It may be in my home life. It might be at work. Do I think of being at work as an opportunity to influence people for God, or is work just 8 hours a day that I'm unaccountable and or just doing menial task for an employer? We need to be strategic in thinking about where we are in different places in our life, and how do we use that in a way that is going to bring about God's will for things. So, God asks him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he gives this answer, and let's kind of think about what all's happened to Elijah at this point. Okay, he's been threatened to have his life taken away, so now he's running away. He sought isolation. He's being idle, and he's got this I versus they mentality. I'm doing all these wonderful things for God. Everyone else is working against me and working against God. Whenever we have an I versus they mentality, we're probably in a dangerous place. I can't think of any conflict that I've ever had with anyone where the conflict was totally dependent on them and had nothing to do with me or my influence or impact on them. There's always if I think about it, there's always something that I could have done better that might have made that situation better. But Elijah, again, is seeing the world through special glasses that sees only the negativity that's going on. So he's running, isolation, idleness, I versus they mindset. Elijah was broken at this point. He was experiencing brokenness. Curious, have you ever experienced brokenness where the circumstances just overwhelmed you and you didn't know how to get out of where you were? At some point in our lives, if we live long enough, I think all of us are going to experience brokenness. Matter of fact, I'm sure of it. I think the Bible tells us that there are two main sources of brokenness. One of them is sin. Sometimes we're broken because of our sin. And when I think of being broken because of my sin, Psalms 51 is a passage that comes to my mind where the King David, one of the great men of God in the Bible, dealt with his sin before God. He was broken by his sin, and Psalms 51 is his prayer of repentance to God, trying to make things right with God. If we're dealing with brokenness because of our sins and they have brought consequences that seem to be ruining our lives, I encourage you to turn to Psalms 51 and read how David's heart, being a man after God's own heart, expressed his sorrow for what he had done to the name of God by his sins. But I don't think that's what's going on with Elijah. The other source of brokenness is circumstances. Sometimes the toils and the burdens of life become just too much for us. And we are broken because we're overwhelmed by those. And I think that's what's happening with Elijah. It's the circumstances of his life. You might come up with his reactions to Jezebel's promise and say, well, some of these attitudes are sinful attitudes. But by and large, I think he's mainly just been overwhelmed, not necessarily leading a sinful life. I had a professor at Purdue, and he's considered, the vet school at Purdue is many years been recognized as being a very strong department for pathology. And this guy, his name is Dr. Carlton, was considered one of the greatest pathologists and kind of the founding father of pathology at Purdue. And working under him and then as on faculty with him at times, ask him how he's doing. How are you doing today? And he said, his answer was nearly always, well, I'm struggling and striving. Isn't that what life is about? How are we going to be successful at anything without doing some struggling and striving? Struggling and striving is not a bad thing. We need to struggle and strive. And he was struggling and striving, and for him in his profession, it yielded great results. He did not reach his reputation by taking the easy route out. He was working hard. He was struggling and striving every day, and that brought success for him. But sometimes we may be struggling and striving, and it's maybe related to health problems, maybe very severe health problems. We may be struggling with financial problems, a job, family, security. Wasn't Elijah looking for security? He felt threatened by Jezebel. He's looking for security. And the result of these struggles is one that we may grow, and that's what we saw our Dr. Carlton doing, is he grew through his struggles and striving, but the result is that sometimes we get overwhelmed with those struggles. They are just seem to be more than what we can bear, and the result, when that is the case, is that we develop despair and brokenness. Have you ever been broken, either by sin or by circumstances? Hopefully, we've experienced both, because there's a lot that can be learned by going through a period of brokenness. I think in this context, God responds to Elijah's brokenness with two solutions. This is not necessarily comprehensive of all circumstances, but there are two answers that I see anyway that God gives him as Elijah is facing his brokenness before God because of the circumstances of his life. So back to our passage in 1 Kings 19. God asked him, "What are you doing?" Elijah gave his response, and then God's answer begins with a go. And there's a go number one and a go number two. Those are the two responses that God gives to help Elijah with the brokenness of his circumstances. And so beginning in verse 11 of 1 Kings 19, he says, Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. Go out and stand on the mount before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, that breaks rocks too. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire can destroy all the living things that are left behind from that kind of wind and that kind of an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low voice, a whisper. And when Elijah heard it, when he heard the whisper, he wrapped his face in his cloak, and he went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. What God wanted Elijah to do was to experience him. He wanted him to experience God, to know who God really is. The description here of a wind that can break rocks, that puzzles me. How does a wind break large rocks? I mean, I've seen pictures of tornadoes in Alabama. There was one several years ago that was a mile wide, and it went for about 40 miles. And if you saw pictures of that tornado that went through that section of Alabama, it looked like somebody got a lawnmower and just went over the land from basically from Bessemer, Alabama, down to Tuscaloosa, where the University of Alabama is. And there was just this large swath of everything's gone. I don't know that even broke rocks. What power is involved there? And the earthquakes work power. And I guess what my thought goes back to is, with experiencing God's power, if I'm fearful of Jezebel, a wind that would break rocks, how would Jezebel survive that? God is able to deliver. But am I ready for him to deliver? Or, as was brought out in our class this morning, maybe he chooses, for reasons that are beyond me, not to deliver, but yet knowing that he has my soul in safekeeping, I am willing to go through those challenges even if he doesn't deliver me. So the first solution, I think, that's described is God saying, go out and stand before the Lord. See, feel, hear, experience the Lord. Experience him. He's powerful. God already had brought down fire on the altar in chapter 18. He's the wind, the earthquake, and the fire. Now God is powerful. He has the ability to deliver, and I need to trust him in that. But then he can also approach me with a whisper, a low whisper. He's also gentle. And oftentimes when we're discouraged and in despair, the power plays don't have a great impact on us. They just overwhelm us further. Sometimes we need the soft whisper, the low whisper, for us to respond when we've been overwhelmed by our circumstances. And that is what God used, and that's what Elijah responded to when he covered his head and went out to see what was going on. It reminds me of 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 14, where we have people that are having different types of struggles. And Paul writes, we urge you, brethren, admonish the idle. That's something that's kind of a power play. Admonish the idle, but look at these other circumstances. Encourage the faint-hearted. Help the weak. Be patient with them all. There are some people that need the force of God. Some people need the gentleness of God. And when we put these two together, we get the concept of meekness. And, that is what God and Jesus are to us, as they are meek, have power, but also gentleness. In Revelation chapter 5, when John and the people, citizens of heaven, were looking for someone who was competent to open the scroll that they had, John was told not to worry, that the Lion of Judah is here. He's worthy to open the scroll. And when John looked up to see the Lion of Judah, what he saw was a lamb that was slain. The power of a lion, but the gentleness of a slain lamb. Jesus is also described in Isaiah 42 and verse 3 by saying that a bruised reed he will not break. If you ever seen reed that has been bent, it falls over, and you can't stick it back up. Once it's broken and falls over, it's down. But here it says that Jesus is going to be one who, a bruised reed he will not break. He can deal gently with those that are damaged. That's us. And his gentleness and meekness is available to us. So, God called Elijah to experience him. And Elijah did. So God asked a second time, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah, he gives the same answer. He hasn't really changed. He's experienced God, but he's not changed yet. And I think that may be a lesson for us, is that sometimes people who are broken, people who are experiencing brokenness, it's hard to change that mindset immediately. Sometimes it takes some healing to take place before there is improvement in that attitude. So God asked him, why are you here? And Elijah gives the same answer again. God doesn't really address his answer directly at this time, but he brings up his second answer to Elijah's dilemma. He asked him, what are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah gives his answer. And then God's answer number 2 also begins with a go. The Lord said to him, go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. And Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat of Abel-Meholah, you shall anoint to be a prophet in your place. These 3 men, if you read continuing in 1 Kings, are 3 agents of change. They each play a role in bringing out God's plans for Israel and for his kingdom. They are agents of change, and although there is Elisha who is going to be in Elijah's place, God is saying to him, you are near the end. I'm going to find someone to take your place as a prophet, but I'm not finished with you yet. You still have some jobs to do for me, and these are going to, as are listed here. So, the second solution is to go and return, go back to where you were. That is the place where your work is going to be accomplished. And I think the summary of what God is calling for Elijah to do is really to reframe your view of what's going on. You need to look at things differently than what you're looking at them. And so his question, what are you doing here? The you, his identity, is that you are my prophet, and I think God's telling him in gentle but firm way, act like it. You need to get busy. You need to be doing things. What are you doing here? What is your purpose? Well, you should be doing my business. You're going to anoint these agents of change that are carrying on my work after you are gone. There is purpose. He should be doing those things. And then what place? What are you doing here? He should be doing God's work. But you don't belong here. This is not where my work occurs in isolation. You need to go to where my work is being active, and you need to do that work there. And then finally, he brings up the fact that you are not, he had this misconception, you are not and never were alone. I have at least 7,000 people that have been reserved that are still serving me. You are not and never were alone. And lots of times when we've been overwhelmed, when we are discouraged and in despair, we feel like we're the only one and everyone else has forsaken us. And that's not the case. Jesus will never leave us or forsake us. Important lesson there. So, the last point that I'd like to make is that a bigger lesson from this that we see from time to time in the Old Testament is that God had plans for Elijah. He expected him to anoint these agents of change before he finished his work for God. And yet Elijah ran away from those responsibilities. All of these, I'm going to show this up here. In this area is where Jehu, the new king of Israel, is going to be coming from. We have Elisha inhabited this area and here near Mount Carmel, and then Syria, Damascus is a little bit up off the map over here, but all of these are within probably a 30 or 60 mile radius of Mount Carmel. By avoiding what God wanted him to do, Elijah ran all the way down over 300 miles away. And maybe there's a lesson from that. When we try to run from God's plan, the return trip is often much longer. A very similar phenomenon was seen with Jonah. It's his trying to avoid God's work. So, I leave you with the question that God was asking Elijah, and I encourage us to spend some time reflecting on how we are doing in our service to God. The question is, what are you doing here? John, or any of you put your name in there, and maybe we can learn some lessons from Elijah and what he went through. If you have any needs that we as a congregation of God's people can help you with, if you need prayers, if you want to come into a saving relationship with Jesus Christ, you believe in him as the Son of God and as your Savior, and you want to be baptized for the remission of your sins, to have those sins removed, if we can be helpful to you in any way, we'd encourage you to come forward as we stand and sing.